Mark Singh Putterman is a writer and educator whose work focuses on histories of the US empire and Asian American internationalism. He is currently a PhD candidate at Brown University. His talk today draws on two recent essays, China and the American Lake, published in Monthly Review, and Policing the Borders of Anti-Asian Violence, published in Roar Magazine. And Mark, you can take it away.
Great. Thanks very much, Gerard, for the introduction and to the DSA International Committee for the invitation. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay. Yeah, it's really an honor to be here and in particular to speak alongside this international panel of anti-imperialist organizers. Whoops. Let's see. So I've been tasked with providing some historical context for understanding the nature of US imperialism in Asia and the Pacific. And I hope in this short talk to outline in really broad strokes the long historical process through which US imperialism has identified the Pacific region as the linchpin of US global power, a vision of the Pacific as what's been termed an American lake, which continues to guide US policy to this day. So in recent years, we've heard over and over from politicians, business elites, and military strategists that the future of US global power is to be decided in Asia and the Pacific. As Secretary of State Hillary Clinton put it in 2011, the 21st century would be America's Pacific century. Clinton promised that renewed US commitments to the region would, quote, pay dividends for continued American leadership well into this century. And under Barack Obama's pivot to Asia, these commitments took the form of a military rebalancing and the pushing of free trade agreements such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Subsequent administrations have continued this diagnosis of Asia and the Pacific as the keystone of continued US hegemony. For instance, the 2018 Trump-era document, the US Strategic Framework for the Indo-Pacific, similarly called for the maintenance of US diplomatic, economic, and military preeminence in what it describes as the world's most populous and economically diverse region. So as the Department of Defense now designates the Pacific as its priority theater, it is the People's Republic of China in particular that's been marked as the region's primary antagonist. Since at least 2019, the Pentagon has labeled China the United States' most consequential strategic competitor, a so-called revisionist power whose ambitions undermine the project of US regional preeminence. Yet, despite the implied temporality of a new Cold War with China, the United States' identity as a Pacific power comes with long historical precedent, one which National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien invoked in introducing the 2018 Indo-Pacific Framework. He wrote, quote, "The United States is and always has been an Indo-Pacific nation, from the first American trading ships that departed for China just 8 years after the American Revolution." This rare historical transparency reflects the fact that pursuit of China's supposedly limitless markets has been a defining discourse of the United States since its formation. Just as visions of contemporary US empire are staked to the Pacific region, the 19th century formation and expansion of an American continental and overseas empire were shaped by the pursuit of trans-Pacific domination. This Pacific orientation is really at the core of American imperial identity, as depicted in this 1861 mural titled "Westward, the Course of Empire Takes Its Way," in which American settlers look out on the golden horizon of San Francisco's Bay, a golden gate to Asian wealth. From the expeditions of Lewis and Clark to the settlement of California, Oregon, and Washington, and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, the violent settler colonial conquest of the continent itself was premised on access to the markets of the Far East. Naval officer Robert Wilson Shufeldt, who led the first US expedition of gunboat diplomacy to Korea in 1882, put this nexus of settler colonialism and commercial empire in intimate terms. He wrote, quote, "The Pacific is the ocean bride of America. China, Japan, and Korea, and their innumerable islands, hanging like necklaces about them, are the bridesmaids. California is the nuptial coach, the bridal chamber, where all the wealth of the Orient will be brought to celebrate the wedding, end quote. And China, long described as the El Dorado of commerce, was the cornerstone of this discourse. American promoters frequently promised that China would be for American imperial capitalism what India had been for the British. Following the pronouncement of the closing of the continental frontier in 1890, the decade of the 1890s crystallized the structure of US Trans-Pacific Empire, consolidating a network of coaling stations, military staging grounds, and market access, which endures to this day. To briefly recount, in 1893, a militia of American settlers, aided by the US Marines, overthrew the Hawaiian Kingdom and put in place a settler government. By 1898, the Hawaiian Islands would be formally annexed as a US territory, consolidating American sugar plantation interests while also securing the islands as a so-called halfway house for US ambitions further west into the Pacific. That same year, Spain ceded the Philippines and Guam to the United States at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, beginning an era of US colonial administration and, in the Philippines, the suppression of a Filipino independence movement, which would claim the lives of more than 200,000 civilians over the next 5 years. Somewhat ironically, this decade of violent colonial expansion coincided with a romantic ideal of US anti-colonialism. In 1899, Secretary of State John Hay put forth his famous open door notes, a notice to competing imperialist powers stating the United States' opposition to the territorial partition of China. The US demanded the maintenance of the status quo of colonial concessions in which British, Japanese, and American commercial interests could freely compete in treaty ports like Shanghai. Of course, this open system was forged through 2 bloody opium wars over the supposed right of Western traders to traffic opium into Chinese territory. While the United States couched its open door policy as a righteous defense of Chinese sovereignty, the concept is better understood as ushering in an era of free trade imperialism, the capitalist domination of underdeveloped markets without formal colonial rule. Here, it's particularly important to understand the interrelationship between these different forms of imperialism in consolidating US power in the Pacific. Settler colonialism in Hawaii and colonial warfare in the Philippines coincided with the pursuit of an open door empire in China. The China trade loomed large over debates on the annexation of Hawaii and the retention of the Philippines. The administration of President McKinley made this connection clear, stating, quote, "We must have Hawaii to help us get our share of China." Similarly, calls to annex the Philippines as an American colony pointed not only to the inherent value of the Philippines, but also its importance for regional US strategy. Speaking before Congress in 1900, leading advocate of imperialism, Senator Albert Beveridge, insisted on the full retention of the Philippines as a US territory. He stated, quote, "The Philippines are ours forever, and just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. We will not retreat from either. The Pacific is our ocean," end quote. American strategists envisioned the Philippines as what they called an American Hong Kong, a launchpad for commercial and military escapades into China and beyond. And in 1900, the strategic military value was realized. The United States dispatched more than 5,000 American troops from the Philippines to China to join the other imperial powers in suppressing the Chinese Boxer uprising against foreign influence and imperialism. So to jump forward in this chronology a little bit, by the end of World War II, the United States had reconsolidated its grip over the Pacific from the challenge of Japanese imperialism. As the Cold War began, the regional encirclement of Asia shifted registers from a program of commercial penetration to one of anti-communist containment. In the American imagination, China's socialist revolution and the founding of the People's Republic in 1949 slammed shut the long-desired open door. Meanwhile, local socialist and national liberation movements throughout Asia were chalked up to the schemes of Soviet and Chinese intervention. This discourse painted communist China as harboring imperialist ambitions, as depicted in this highly racialized political cartoon, rendering the United States a benevolent protector of what it termed free Asia. In this context, we should remember that the Korean and Vietnam Wars were not discrete affairs, but part of a structure of US imperialism which sought to retain Asia as an uncontested sphere of US domination. This regional calculus shaped the prosecution of US intervention. For instance, the Korean War saw the bombing of Chinese infrastructure at the border of Korea and Northeast China, and General Douglas MacArthur spoke openly of expanding the war into China, an aspiration lobbied for by the nationalist regime in Taiwan, which saw in US intervention in Korea an opportunity to retake the Chinese mainland. This regional structure became even more clear amidst US intervention in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. More than 350,000 South Korean troops fought in Vietnam under the Park regime, as did more than 10,000 soldiers and military workers from the Philippines. Meanwhile, B-52 bombers dispatched from Okinawa conducted bombing raids over North Vietnam. Simulated war exercises in Oahu cast native Hawaiians as enemy combatants, and American GIs engaged in rampant sexual and economic violence in Thailand, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and beyond as part of euphemistically termed rest and recuperation tours. To close, I think this history remains relevant because the contemporary consolidation of US military and commercial hegemony in the Pacific to counter China's rise bears all the historical patterns of its formation and extension in the 19th and 20th centuries. Like 19th century Pacific expansion, revived Cold War militarism renders sovereign Pacific island nations, from Hawaii to Guam and Okinawa, mere island chains bound in strategic containment of China. Likewise, the pattern of Cold War militarization that manifests in permanent US military bases in Korea, the Philippines, and Okinawa are reinscribed as liberal protection of US allies from China's purportedly expansionist aspirations. In reality, this so-called defensive posture simply repackages the historical form and function of US trans-Pacific imperialism. Recent military calls to regain the advantage from China in the region only threaten to intensify this violence. For instance, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, a 2021 budget request for more than $27 billion in congressional funding, is now set to expand missile defense sites in Guam, training facilities in Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands, and expand joint force exercises with Korea and Japan. This regional calculus of US empire requires regional resistance. At this historical juncture, we must link all movements for peace, decolonization, demilitarization, to see how the justification of renewed Cold War aggression with China provides cover for the extension of a trans-Pacific American empire, which has colonized the people's aspirations for peace and sovereignty across the Pacific for more than a century. As the US lays claim to imperial stewardship over what it terms a free and open Indo-Pacific, we must remember that this region contains more than 60% of the world's population and more than half of the surface of the planet. The fight against US empire in Asia and the Pacific is thus truly a global struggle for self-determination and national liberation, but also for the future of a habitable planet itself. If the 21st century is to truly be a Pacific century, it will be defined not on the terms of the US empire, but by the broad masses of people seeking sovereignty, peace, and cooperation. Thank you very much.